Well, this is the anniversary of one of the greatest prophetic fulfillments of all time. Do you know what it is? 64 years ago, today it happened. Well, what happened was, it had been prophesied for 2,500 years, but the United Nations voted on November the 29th, 1947, to approve the partitioning of the land called Palestine, creating a Jewish state and the Palestinian state. Now, the Palestinians immediately rejected it. They wanted nothing to do with it. However, it was certainly a banner day. The Jewish people were just 2 years out of Hitler's horrible crematoriums. They danced in the streets. The scenes were amazing, what actually happened there. Let me just run down through with you some of the events. And before I do, I asked my son-in-law, Dave Robbins, to be on the program with us today. As you know, I've been fighting a little bit of a problem with my throat, and so with a little bit of a flu. So I thought, well, if I totally break down, at least Dave would be here to pick up the pieces and put it back together again. So Dave's also one of the ministers here at Endtime Ministries. Some of you may have already talked to him. Anyway, glad to have you, Dave.
Well, it's good to be here, Irvin. Thank you.
Okay, well, I want to talk about this because this is a big deal. I'm talking about one of the greatest prophetic fulfillments of all time. You're not hearing me. I'm talking about one of the greatest prophetic fulfillments of all times. And we're going to go through it. We want to show you today where it is in the Bible and what actually has happened. Well, let's go back. In 1917, Lord Balfour of Great Britain issued his now famous Balfour Declaration. Then 30 years later, after much campaigning, after the terrible Holocaust where 6 million Jews died, finally the impetus built for the United Nations to declare a homeland for the Jewish people. The vote was taken. Well, before I go there, let me make sure you understand what's going on. Now, due to the Balfour Declaration that there should be a homeland in Palestine, the Jews were caught up in this vision, and they began to make their way to the land at that time called Palestine. Today we know it as Israel, or the Holy Land. Then the British, after World War I, were over all that part of the world. Prior to World War I, it was the Ottoman Empire ruled by Turkey for, 400 years or so. But as of World War I, it swung into the hands of the British, and that's the reason that Lord Balfour's declaration had such power and weight to it. So he made his declaration. This caused the Jews, they were already headed back, but this caused the pace of the immigration into the Holy Land to speed up. Well, then it started causing problems because now then the Arabs were attacking the Jews as they arrived. Now, this was very sparsely populated here. This was not a crowded area. There were not big cities. There were not heavy concentrations of population. So when the Jews arrived, they began to build towns and settlements, and after a while, animosity arose between the Arabs and the Jews. Imagine that. Actually, that had been going on ever since Ishmael and Isaac, way back, the two sons of Abraham. Nonetheless, the animosity was stirring. So the British cut off the immigration. But the Jews were so desperate by this time, they couldn't go through anything worse than Hitler's Holocaust. So they just kept going back at great risk to their lives. Finally, on November the 29th of 1947, there was a vote that was held at the United Nations. They needed 2/3 of the UN General Assembly for this motion to partition the Palestinian territory. At that time, it was called Palestine, and actually the Jews were called Palestinians. Things have changed since that time, but that land was known as Palestine because the Romans designated it that when they banished the Jews from there way back in 70 AD. So it had become commonly referred to as Palestine, and some of the Jews were actually called Palestinian Jews. Well, anyway, the vote was taken on November the 29th of 1947. They needed 2/3 to pass. The total voters were 56. Those were the total members of the United Nations at that time. It was a huge buildup leading up to this. The Jews were out diplomatically campaigning, vote yes for an Israeli state. On the other hand, the enemies of the Jewish people were pressuring people to vote no's. So when the vote finally came in, it was close. It ended up being 33 in favor, 13 against, with 10 abstentions. So it cleared by something. It had to do 66 and 2/3%. I think they got 71%. So there was just one or two votes that carried the day. Well, the Jewish people, they danced in the streets all night that night. And Mr. David Ben-Gurion, who was the recognized leader of the Jewish people, made a statement: long live the Hebrew state. Now, the reason he called it that is because they didn't have a name yet. They didn't know what they were going to call their new name at that particular time. Now, this was November 29 of 1947. However, the Jewish state would not actually be born until about 6 months later, May 14 of 1948. Now, the thing that pushed this toward the May 14 date was the British said, we're washing our hands of this place. It's nothing but bloodshed. It's not worth it to us. We're going home. And so they brought an end to what was called the British Mandate. They had been in charge of this area of the country of the Middle East since World War I. But they said, it's not worth it. We're out of here. And we're turning it over to the United Nations. So finally, the mandate was actually up on May the 14th of 1948. Well, this left the Jews with no authority in the Middle East to back them up. So that's what provoked David Ben-Gurion and the Israeli leaders to have a meeting and to declare Israeli independence that day. Now, let's remember what happened here. The United Nations on November the 29th, 64 years ago today, declared the re-existence of an Israeli state. Now, remember, there had not been an Israeli state for 2,000 years. The Jewish people had been filtered through the nations. They were driven out of their homeland by the Romans 30 or so years after the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. They had said, let his blood be upon us and upon our children. And because of their rejection, Jesus himself prophesied that it was going to happen. Jesus wept over Jerusalem. And he said, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how oft I would have gathered you together as a hen would her brood, but you would not. And because you have not known this, the day of your visitation, your house is left unto you desolate. Of course, all of you are familiar with the Matthew 24 prophecy where Jesus said, not one stone will be left upon another of this temple. It's all coming down. Well, 30 short years later, the prophecy of Jesus was fulfilled, and the Romans drove the Jewish people out of the homeland. They actually passed laws against Jews living in the city of Jerusalem. So for the next 2,000 years, Jews were filtered through Poland, Russia, France, Great Britain, Czechoslovakia, and of course the United States of America over time. But 2,000 long years, the only reason the Jewish people survived as a nation at all was because they held to one thing, and that was that they should not intermarry with Gentiles. And because they held to that teaching from the scripture, that allowed them to retain their identity as a nation, even though they were filtered through the nations of the world. I'm talking about every conceivable nation on earth had a Jewish presence in it. And this went on for 2,000 long years. It's an amazing thing. And on today, November 29th, today, 64 years ago, the United Nations declared the establishment of an Israeli state after 2,000 years of exile. Now, all of this that I have described to you is prophesied in the Bible. And let me finish one thing before we actually go to the scriptures. On May 14, 1948, when the British mandate ended, David Ben-Gurion made a speech declaring Israeli statehood and Israeli independence. And when he was asked what that state would be called, he said, "Our name is Israel." So the promise of Jacob, remember the story of Jacob. You've got the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob wanted so bad to have the birthright, but his older brother Esau had it. Jacob finagled to get the birthright, and then he managed to also get the blessing. But more importantly, he had a prayer meeting one night with God, and he prevailed with God. He wrestled with God until the breaking of the day. And they said, the angel said to him, "Let me go." He said, "I will not let you go until you bless me. I've spent my whole life for this moment. I'm not going to allow this time to pass me by. I will not let you go until you bless me." The angel said, "What's your name?" He said, "Jacob," because the word Jacob meant supplanter, conniver. Well, Jacob had always been that type of a person. If you're going to have a business dealing with Jacob, you better cross every T and dot every I, because he would cheat you. Well, the angel said to Jacob, "Your name will no longer be Jacob. Now your name is going to be Israel. For as a prince, thou hast prevailed with man and with God." So the name Israel was born way back then. What was that? That was 2,900 years ago. And yet today on the Mediterranean Sea, there's this little nation called Israel that's an integral part of God's plan for the earth and the human race. Amazing.